What's your take on playing the long game versus the short game?
Well, I went into business to build something, right? So uh, when I was young and not very bright, I'll remember one of my first jobs was in car sales. And by the way, so you imagine when you get out of college that your parents paid for and said, "Hey, Dad, great news! I'm going into sales. I'm going to be selling cars." Right? And there's this long, awkward pause on the other end of the phone, as I'm sure he's probably, just putting his face, in his hands. But young and not very bright, and so it was like this idea of, well, let's get all we can every sale, right? Let's sell this, if we can. Why aren't we marking this up even more? Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we throwing this on there? And then, I realized there were some people in the dealership who'd been there for 30 years and they didn't have to go out on the lot and wait for somebody to drive up because they had people coming in every day asking for them. And what I realized is, when you build something for the long term, yeah, you may lose out on some initial revenue and money in that first bit, but it pays off so much, down the road, so much more down the road because you've treated people right. You've even maybe turned down opportunities when you've, been told them. I've had to do that in my business, right? I've had conversations where I knew I could sell something to these folks. They were desperate. They needed help, but I had to be honest and say, you know what you're looking for is really not in my wheelhouse. Right. And I don't want to tell you that I can do this when this isn't really where my focus is. And so if you need help with this and this and this, we knock it out of the park and I'd be happy to. But if you're looking for this, I'll see if I can, maybe give you a referral to somebody who might be able to help you. But for me, it's not a fit. And so that's what we found. And eventually, my experience now, 5 years into this journey as a business owner, it pays off every time for me, right? Not in the initial, but long term, you're going to be so much happier when you take that long view of things versus just, handling it, trying to take advantage maybe, or even just selling something that is probably not in the best interest of that customer.
So when I hear that story about your dad, I think about everyone is a salesperson, right? Everyone is a salesman, right? And I think that you did a really poor job of explaining to him that you were going to do this, right? And so that's what you were going to do after these 4 years, because he had probably a built up, he had compound interest of Chad's going to do this next. I just spent all this money. He's going to do that next. And so the concept of everyone as a salesman, I think, is interesting because I don't think everyone thinks that. Yet we're always trying to we're always trying to convince someone of some transaction, right? Yeah. I'm trying to get this girl to go on a date with me. I'm trying to get this job. I'm trying to explain to my dad why it's okay that I'm going to be late tonight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So looking back at this, I don't know how many years it's been, but looking back, like, what would you have done to painted a better picture to explain to your dad so he would have been excited that you're going into that instead of, oh God, Chad, I just spent all this money, and maybe you were that person that Lizzo was talking about on the Minnesota Vikings.
Well, so you bring up a good point, and I think there's so many ways you can go with the Zack, but I think the first thing I would say is, what you're talking about, or at least what I call it, everybody wants more influence, right? Everybody. Not everybody wants to learn how to sell. In fact, I've got clients who the ownership tells me, Chad, we're putting these people in your training and we're going to send this group in, but you cannot call it sales training. You will have people running out. We'll have people turning in their resignation, right? So what we talk about then is, all right, let's talk about how to gain more influence. Would you be interested in being able to influence more people, including maybe even your kids? Would you like to have more influence over them, your spouse? Would you like to have more influence at work with your boss, right? And so some of it is just in the way we couch things. The other thing, in terms of my specific story about dealing with my dad, I think a couple things. One is I probably should have set expectations more clearly, right? What I did is waited, I waited until I absolutely had to make that call to tell them, hey, here's what I'm getting ready to do. And one of the mistakes we make, I think, in whether in business or sales of any kind, is not setting clear expectations for people. And, and you're talking about, so I had obviously realized at some point, I kind of want to do this whole entrepreneurial thing, sales thing. And I was kind of leading that way. But I was sort of afraid to make that, because I knew that probably wasn't what he, quote unquote, wanted for me. And so I waited till I actually had to call and make that call. So that was part of the issue. The other thing I think that, of course, it's easy to look back and say this now, is had I realized even in those first couple sales jobs I had, how much I would learn that would help me in life. It was amazing. About that same time as I went into selling cars, I got involved in a MLM. And so, right, there's another great thing. Tell your parents after you went to college, hey, I'm also involved in a multi-level marketing company. That'll really, that'll accelerate the inheritance as they all have a heart attack right on the phone.
Nothing the matter with either of those, Chad. Nothing the matter with them.
Well, that's going to be my point, because here's what I'm going to tell you is, while neither of those made me wealthy or was where I found my ultimate career, I started to learn in both of those instances, through the MLM as well as the job at the dealership, these life lessons. And particularly, I was introduced to this field of what we call personal development, which is this idea of ongoing, right, self-education and continually learning, how can I get better at this? And so that was a gift I got from those opportunities. Was I started to learn about people who were in this field of, achievement and sales and entrepreneurship, that I would, if I had taken a regular, quote unquote, legitimate job right out of college. And at that time, if I'd have said, hey, I got a job, sitting at a desk making, whatever, $28,000 a year, they'd have been like, oh, good, good. Now stay there for 40 years and, retire.
It's not about the money, right? It's not about the money in these situations. It's about the company's perception, right? And then the compound interest that's been building up on that company's perception year after year after year. And so oftentimes the material that is sent out is outliers in many cases, where people think, oh, this used car salesman, if this one person did this, that means all used car salesmen are shady or whatever, right? The same thing with the Hollywood effect with the salesperson that we were talking about earlier, not used cars, just general salesperson, right? Yeah. And so it's the compound interest of that building block after block after block after block of whatever that thing is perceived as, even if you've had an amazing situation with that. Yeah. And I think that's something that's difficult for people to comprehend and peel back the onion and be like, well, hold on. Is this real perception is this the real indicator of what I would get if I worked with this company? Or is it perceived because a couple of bad apples have been in there? And I think oftentimes, if you see thousands of reviews of bad things on Amazon, then maybe that's a good telling sign. But like one or two, usually that's not a bad sign. And I think oftentimes we have to be thinking about, why are people actually perceiving this thing in the way that they are, one way or the other, right? I mean, why do people think Anomaly was the greatest book ever written? Duh, because this guy with long locks of love wrote it. I mean, come on, people.